Thank you very much for joining us, Prashant. So first of all, you're from the William Davidson Institute, the University of Michigan. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
So I direct a healthcare research initiative at the William Davidson Institute. The institute is focused on taking business knowledge to emerging market economies and making sure that development is not hindered because they don't have the right business knowledge.
It's a very interesting area, and in fact I believe that's what you were talking about earlier at the conference. Perhaps if you could start telling us a little bit more about what you spoke about.
So I think the conference generally is about supply chains and the role they play in making pharmaceuticals reach the populations they're intended for, but oftentimes we lose track of certain parts of the population, such as the ones that live in sub-Saharan Africa or low-income countries, who oftentimes can afford to pay at least a certain price, but the supply chain fails them because it's very hard to reach to the areas where they live, or it's easier to reach but at price points which they cannot afford. So my talk was on how can the pharmaceutical industry, and especially supply chain people within the industry, contribute to making sure that business grows, but at the same time access to medicines to poor populations is also higher.
Now that to me sounds massively counterintuitive, the idea that you can do something that's obviously more complicated to a market that theoretically is often struggling for finance. How you can turn that around and make it into a positively successful business model. What approaches are being looked at?
So I think if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, what you realize is that the retail price at which pharmaceuticals are selling, where populations are paying private out of pocket for buying the medicines, only a very small fraction of that is actually going to the manufacturer. A larger fraction of that retail price is actually markups for the wholesaler, the sub-wholesaler, and the retailer. And oftentimes those markups are as high as 100%, 200%. So if the supply chain is designed well, which means there is enough credit in the system, there is enough competition in the system, it's not an exclusive single distributor, then what that does is it decreases the markups charged by intermediaries in the channel, decreases the price to the patient, more people can afford it. As a result, the manufacturer's revenue grows and intermediaries in the system are cut out. So that's the kind of approach we've talked about, such as having a pre-wholesaling arrangement in some countries, which will allow more competition, lower prices, things like that.
It's a great idea, but how do you convince people then you're asking to reduce their markups? If you're trying not to bring the price up of the product, people have to therefore at some point lose out. How are they getting on board with this? What's in it for those people? Or are we just working around them?
So no, we're not working around them. I think it's about building the case that you can either make your money by selling small volumes at high markups, or you can make the same amount of money by charging lower markup and selling larger volumes. And oftentimes people don't get that business case or that relationship very clearly, and we are trying to build stronger business cases so that a wholesaler, a sub-wholesaler, an importer sees that if they were to reduce their markups, they will still make the same amount of money. It's just that it'll come by serving a larger fraction of the population.
So how are you getting through to those people then? What approaches are being taken to make sure that message is brought across? Because it's quite a complicated idea in many ways.
Yeah, so I think it is challenging, and there is a sense of complacency about markets in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily because many commercial players think this is a market which is stable, it doesn't increase much, so why change anything in this? Let's continue with our status quo. And the challenge is in trying to build this business case that you can reach a larger number of people and not lose revenue, we have to push it from the manufacturer's side, who has some influence over the distributors they select, over the wholesalers they select. So if we can convince the pharmaceutical manufacturers that in their selection processes, in their relationships and the contracting they set up, if they could ensure that wider reach is emphasized, this could become a reality more than just a few pilots.
And on the subject of wider reach, actually I'll come back to the pilots in a moment, but on the subject of wider reach, it does sound like it have wider implications in that, particularly in areas like sub-Saharan Africa, often pharmaceutical companies are demonized for what they do, despite what they're actually providing. And if there's a way to reduce the cost, to make it more accessible, to get it to more people more easily, more cheaply, this can surely only be a good thing for the pharmaceutical companies as a whole on a global scale.
Absolutely. I think what happens is when retail prices remain high, the end patient has little ability to understand, is it the manufacturer who's charging such a high price? Is it the retailer?
Or should they care?
Yeah, exactly, and they don't necessarily understand, and NGOs and other agencies oftentimes are the only ones who give them some basis of information, which is pharmaceutical companies could be charging a very high price. So it is important to get this message across that distribution markups along the chain are so high and we need to do something about it.
So it is then still in a pilot phase at the moment?
So we have small pilots we're doing in Tanzania, which is me and my colleagues and a research team. But some companies who are here, for instance, have also started their own pilots, which are looking at some of the recommendations that had come out of our research. And at least a few of them are showing promising results where they have continued to maintain their profits, if not increased, but have certainly increased the coverage of their products.
So when are you hoping this will become brought to a wider audience and to actually come to full fruition?
So I think it's still, I would put the timeline to be something like 5 years before you'll see this as larger scale commercial operations more than smaller pilots just to test out approaches.
Well, in which case, I'm very much looking forward to seeing you with your success story at Pharma 2017.
Absolutely.
And fingers crossed that's exactly what will happen. Thank you very much for taking the time out. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.